people, and it's just a handful of us, called People for Democratic Revolution, Boston. We are aiming to, obviously we have to recruit a lot of people to help do this, but we are aiming to collect 130 million signatures for this statement, this I believe. I don't know if you can read it. Oh.
Yeah, that's fine.
That's okay. It's on the back of that sheet. And it basically says we need to remove the rich from power, we need to have a society like what I've been describing, and that what's wrong with our present day society, it's a fake democracy, and it's not a watered down statement at all. It says all of this. And the reason we want to collect 130 million signatures and persuade people to start joining the effort of collecting signatures is A, because we know that it's really easy to collect signatures. It's not a question of persuading people something that they don't already agree with. It's just a question of putting it in front of them and showing them, where to sign. For 3 out of 4, often more people, that's the case. We know that. And the reason that we want to get those signatures is we want to display the signatures to the public. It's not a petition. We're not going to present the signatures to some president or some politician or something like that. We put the signatures on public display, like this, for our first effort at this banner. It's not the greatest, but we're going to improve it the next version, but have more signatures on it. But we tape this banner up on the wall of supermarkets, like the Stop and Shop in Jamaica Plain and others. And we ask people to look at it and see that there's lots and lots of signatures, and we ask them to sign. Most of them do. And if the more signatures we get, ultimately imagine if we had a majority of Americans signing this, and then imagine if a majority of Americans knew that a majority had signed it, okay? So now we're talking about a majority of Americans knowing that despite all the efforts of the mass media to keep it a secret, knowing that they're a majority in feeling this way. Well, the reason that's so important is that when people know that they're in a majority, and when people know that their objective that goes against the establishment is morally right, and so we talk about egalitarianism and how it's practical, because that's a big part of being morally right. When people know that they're morally right in what they want, and they're in the majority, you get a political sea change. You get an end to the hopelessness that comes from people feeling that they're a hopelessly small, weak minority that can't do anything, which is the current situation. Almost everyone who signs this, I believe, says or indicates with body language that, well, I'd love it, but of course it'll never happen, because they feel hopeless. Some people won't even stop just out of hopelessness. They look at our little button logo, let's remove the rich from power, and they laugh with a laugh that says, oh, you guys are, you don't know how impossible that is, right? The hopelessness is so thick you can cut it with a knife, and that's the reason why there's relatively little being done to even start building a movement for egalitarianism.
Why 70% of the people didn't vote recently?
Well, that I would argue that comes from hopelessness about the effectiveness of voting. Yes.
Well, yeah. Right.
Yeah. So what we want to do is we want to change that hopelessness into hopefulness. Because when people know that they're in the majority, they will start to feel a kind of confidence that's completely lacking. Now, what would that lead to? Well, it'll lead to mass organizations, either current ones that don't presently advocate for egalitarianism, advocating it for a change, or new organizations being formed precisely to advocate for an egalitarian goal. See, the reason that a lot of people in organizations that are fighting for various reforms don't talk about, egalitarian revolution is because they think, it's not because they don't want it, it's because they think that if you talk about that, you will lose public support. You will drive people away. So, I was at one of the big rallies a couple of months ago for raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And I went around to all the people who were in the rally listening to the speeches, who were part of the organized group fighting for this. And I asked them, would you read this, I believe, and if you agree, sign it. And virtually all of them signed it, so they want this, right? But they don't call on their leaders to publicly, say, we need an egalitarian society, not just where people get $15 an hour, which can't even support a family of 4, but we need a society where people get what they need because they contribute fairly, right? Why don't they call on their leaders to say that? Why are they not upset and angry that their leaders don't say it? It's because they have been persuaded that it would weaken their movement if they said something like that, because they think that they would lose support from the public. But when people know that actually the majority of the public wants precisely this, then people will start being bold in saying that this is what they want. You'll see even greater confidence come from that. Then something can happen when you have this hundreds of millions of people confident that they're a majority, articulating explicitly their egalitarian revolutionary aims, developing a solidarity and confidence in each other, and developing a determination to actually make this change happen. Then, unlike today, it is possible for this movement to call upon a critical mass of soldiers in the American military forces to refuse orders that they would probably get to suppress the movement. Okay? And when that happens, the rich lose power. This is how the rich lose power. When they no longer have a military where a sufficient number of soldiers obey orders to put down the movement that wants to remove the rich from power, they've lost power. And it's not something that is hard to imagine happening if you consider a couple of events in history. I'll start out with the most recent one. In 1975, Nixon had to withdraw troops from Vietnam in what everyone realized and saw was an ignominious defeat. Everyone remembers the people clinging to the helicopter as it left Saigon, the last days. Why did Nixon withdraw troops? The answer is two things. One is the obvious, which is the Vietnamese were fighting so hard. But that alone, I don't think, explains it. The other is that because, as it was famously said by General Westmoreland when he met General Giap, the Vietnamese commander, General Westmoreland, the commander of U.S. troops in Vietnam, said to him, we never lost a battle. Which is true, actually. And General Giap said, true, but irrelevant. Because what happened is that American troops were refusing to fight. The GIs, despite all the indoctrination in boot camp, which consisted of two-pronged indoctrination. One, the idealistic prong, which is you're fighting tyrannical communism and helping people defend their freedom, which that was one prong. And the other prong was you kill these people, it doesn't matter, they're not humans, they're just gooks. Okay? So despite that indoctrination, the troops saw that this was a popular uprising against foreign occupation and backing of a dictator, and they realized it wasn't a just war, and they didn't want to get killed fighting it. And the resistance took many different forms. One of the most dramatic was soldiers using fragmentation grenades to kill gung-ho officers if they ordered them to fight. That was called fragging. And there was a lot of that, but even more numerically was soldiers going out on search and destroy missions, but just pretending to search, really going someplace safe and radioing back phony radio messages that they were, in a battle when they really weren't. There were instances of American GIs and and Viet Cong reaching informal truces. You know shoot, we know shoot, just waiting it out. But maybe numerically the most overwhelming form of resistance was that the GIs were getting stoned on drugs, marijuana, and other drugs, and were making themselves incapable of fighting. And the brass knew this, and the brass communicated it to the civilian leadership, and Nixon realized he didn't have an army that he could rely on, and that's why they had to withdraw. So if American GIs can be persuaded to disobey orders to shoot foreigners for whom they were given lots of racist and political, propaganda to make them obey those orders, isn't it a lot more likely that with a huge mass movement of Americans who were their own countrymen, their own relatives and friends and neighbors, that they would refuse to shoot, especially if they agreed with, as they would, they're working class people mostly, who are just in the military, to get a college scholarship, or because they think they're taking revenge on the people who did 9/11, but whatever. They have the same values of equality and concern for one another that is what egalitarianism is all about. So the main thing that causes soldiers to fire on their own countrymen is fear that if they don't obey orders, they'll be tried as a traitor and possibly even executed. That's what military discipline is all about. But when the movement is large enough that there is a reasonable chance that with the support of the soldiers it would prevail, then it becomes all the more likely that a soldier would decide to risk, being on the losing side if he disobeys orders, and to take the side that he or she actually supports. So that's why I think it's feasible. Now, historically, one of the most recent examples of a military going over to the side of the people and the ruler having to flee is a situation where the revolution is not one that made things better, but that's a separate point. And I'm talking about the Iranian Revolution. The fact is, the Shah of Iran had the most powerful military in the Middle East, courtesy of the U.S., giving it to him. And he was an absolute, ruthless dictator. And he had the most powerful military in the region. And yet he had to flee. In 1979, I think it was, right? He had to flee. Why? Because the Khomeini, Ayatollah Khomeini, and the Shia Muslim movement succeeded in persuading, a lot of Iranians and a critical mass of soldiers to refuse orders to attack their movement, and so the Shah of Iran had to flee.
That's interesting. How long did that take for that kind of reversal in society?
Oh, I think it was a question of days. I mean,
but what was building up to get?
What was building up was years, I guess. Khomeini was in exile in France and making tape recordings, as I understand. I'm not an expert on this, but what little I've read, he made cassettes, which was sort of like in the 1970s, the technology of the day, right? And those cassettes were played everywhere, and people listened, and the movement grew and so forth. But that took a while. And then in 1968 in France, there was a huge general strike, as you probably know, and de Gaulle, who was president at the time, feared that he could not rely on the French military to put down this strike, and the strike was anybody's guess whether they were going to make a revolution. It turns out that the Communist Party in France, which is like the Democratic Party in the United States, essentially, opposed making a revolution and ordered the workers that it had influence over, which was a lot, back to work. But before that happened, de Gaulle had no assurance that there wasn't going to be a revolution. What did he do? He went to Germany to make arrangements to use German troops to put down the working class and the students in France. because he knew he
Trust
couldn't
the-
rely on French troops to do it. Now, if push had come to shove, which it didn't, but if he had marched into France with German troops, you can imagine how the French would have reacted to that, right? In terms of their rebellion being escalated. But you can also wonder what the German population would have done. You know, I mean, we had a big anti-war movement in the United States because people didn't approve of the war. You think that the German working class would approve of the French, German troops being used to put down a general strike in France? You know, the thing would have spread. Who knows, right? So the point I'm making is that it's not unreasonable to build a large egalitarian revolutionary movement, and it's not unreasonable that it could prevail. I'm not saying anything's easy, but does that answer your question? I mean,
Yes.
that's...
Then I have another question.
Sure.
So obviously this would be a process that takes a while, like for the momentum to build.
At least a week or two.
Yeah. What are some like tangible things that neighborhoods like JP could do right now?
Tangible things you could do. And I'm so glad you asked.
And what can people what can JP do?
Yeah, okay. Well,
Individuals in
I'm
JP
gonna
and JP. Yeah.
respond individuals. This is if you want to volunteer, you can fill that out and give it to us. It's some of the things that it asks if you can do, or can you translate? Because we need translations. If anyone came to this meeting only speaking Spanish, we'd be in big trouble. Can you can subscribe to our email list, which is how to do that's on our webpage, and join a conversation about what to do and how to do it. You can collect signatures for this, I believe, either from people you know personally, or you can go in public places by yourself or